What happens when an entire country goes bankrupt? We all know that companies can go bankrupt. Individuals can also go bankrupt. But what about countries? Can an entire government run out of money? The answer is yes, but not in the way you might imagine. When a country goes bankrupt, it doesn't disappear or shut down. Its people don't vanish. Instead, the government simply reaches a point where it can no longer pay its debts. It's like a credit card that has hit its limit. Except the stakes are much higher. To understand how this happens, we first need to talk about the debt itself. Every government borrows money from banks, from other countries, or by issuing bonds. These bonds work like IOUs, a promise, to repay investors later with interest. As long as investors believe, the government will keep its promise. They are willing to lend more money. But if investors lose confidence, if they think the country might not repay, everything changes. Suddenly, borrowing becomes expensive. Interest rates skyrocket. The government struggles to refinance old debts, and the economy begins to suffocate. This is the first warning sign of a possible national bankruptcy, when borrowing becomes unsustainable. The second sign appears when the government starts printing money to cover costs. At first, this might seem like an easy solution. Just create more money, right? But the more a country prints, the less each unit of currency is worth. Inflation takes control. Prices rise and people's savings lose value. Before long, the national currency begins to collapse. That's when panic begins. Investors pull out their money. Businesses stop investing. Ordinary citizens rush to buy goods before prices rise even higher. And soon after, the economy slows and tax revenues fall, making it even harder for the government to pay what it owes. This is how a country can spiral into financial chaos. But this is where things get more complicated. Unlike a country cannot simply declare bankruptcy in court. There is no single global authority that decides what happens next. Instead, the process becomes political, economic, and deeply human. Creditors, the people and institutions who lent money, must negotiate with the government to restructure the debt. This may mean extending repayment deadlines, reducing the total debt owed, or even forgiving part of the debt entirely. But in some cases, the process can be orderly. The government meets with creditors. They strike a deal, and payments resume. But in others, it's chaotic. Politicians blame investors. Investors blame politicians. Citizens blame both. To truly understand what happens when a country goes bankrupt, let's look at a few famous examples in history. In 2001, Argentina faced one of the most severe defaults in modern history. After years of heavy borrowing and maintaining a fixed exchange rate, pegging its currency to the US dollar, Argentina's economy began to collapse. Unemployment surged, banks froze accounts, and riots broke out in the streets. When the government finally admitted it could not repay its $100 billion debt, Argentina fell into a deep recession lasting many years. Foreign investors fled, and it took nearly a decade for the country to regain trust in global markets. Another example is Greece. In 2000, the Greek government borrowed heavily throughout the 2000s to fund public spending. When the global financial crisis hit, investors realized Greece's debt was much larger than reported. Confidence evaporated overnight. To prevent a complete collapse, the European Union and the International Monetary Fund intervened with massive bailout packages. But those bailouts came with strict conditions: austerity measures, spending cuts, and tax hikes. The Greek people faced years of hardship. Pensions were reduced, unemployment soared, and the economy shrank by a quarter. It was a painful reminder that government debt, though invisible day to day, can ultimately reach into every citizen's life. So what exactly happens to ordinary people when a country goes bankrupt? First, prices typically surge. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Savings in local currency lose value, while imported goods become unaffordable. Second, jobs disappear. Businesses shut down. Investments freeze and unemployment rises. Third, public services, schools, Hospitals, pensions begin to deteriorate as governments run out of money. And finally, trust collapses. People lose faith in their institutions. And it can take generations to rebuild that trust. But not every default ends in total disaster. Some countries recover and rebuild. Take Iceland, for example. It experienced a severe financial crisis in 2008 when its banking sector collapsed. However, within a few years it stabilized its economy, partly because it allowed its banks to fail. Rather than bailing everyone out, Iceland focused on protecting its citizens, not the speculators. It was painful, but it allowed a faster reset. But other countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe weren't as fortunate. Decades of poor governance, corruption, and money printing led to extreme hyperinflation, so severe their currencies became worthless. In Zimbabwe, people once carried bags of cash just to buy bread. In Venezuela, wages lost value faster than they were paid. In both cases, trust in the national currency collapsed. So if a country can't be dragged into bankruptcy court, what keeps governments accountable? The answer lies in reputation and credibility. A nation's credit rating acts like its financial reputation on the world stage. When a country defaults, that reputation is damaged. Investors become cautious, demand higher interest rates, or refuse to lend at all. This limits a government's ability to finance future projects and slows growth for years to come. Some countries eventually rebuild their credibility through discipline and reform. Others repeat the same mistakes. But even if a nation can't disappear, like a bankrupt company, its citizens still pay the price. Higher taxes, job losses, and a lower quality of life that can last for years. In some cases, national bankruptcy leads to political turmoil or even revolution. Once citizens lose faith in their leaders and their money, history shows that eventually they demand change one way or another. But perhaps the most important lesson from these crises, it's not about economics, it's about psychology. Trust is the invisible glue that holds financial systems together. Money itself is just paper or digital numbers. What gives it value is our shared belief that it will be accepted tomorrow. If that belief disappears, even the strongest economies can collapse. That is why trust is often called the most valuable currency of a nation. When people stop trusting their government, their banks, or their currency, the entire system begins to unravel. Once trust is gone, no law or policy can fix it immediately. It takes time, transparency, and accountability to rebuild. This is why economic stability depends on perception as much as mathematics. Numbers may tell a story, but psychology determines how that story ends. If people believe recovery is possible, they will invest, work, and rebuild. If they lose hope, no bailout can save the system. So when we ask, what happens when a nation goes bankrupt? The real answer is deeper than finance. The bankruptcy of a nation is not the end of its story. It is a moment of reckoning, a test of trust and collective resilience. The roads still exist. People still work and the land still produces. What disappears is trust, and what must return is integrity. Because ultimately, money is a reflection of trust. When trust shatters, the mirror breaks. And when trust returns, even a nation that has gone bankrupt can rise again. That is why every financial crisis, no matter how severe, carries a lesson. Nations endure not because they are rich, but because they are trusted. Trust cannot be printed. It cannot be borrowed. It must be built and once lost. It can take generations to restore. So the next time you hear about a country drowning in debt or defaulting, remember this. Behind every number is a story of trust in leaders, in institutions, and in one another. Because the real currency of any nation is not paper or digital code. It is trust. When that trust fades, bankruptcy follows. When it returns, recovery begins. And that is what truly happens when a nation goes bankrupt. It is not just an economic collapse. It is the breaking and rebuilding of collective trust. A reminder that money can move markets, But only trust can move nations. Because in the end, no matter how advanced the monetary system, all economies rest on a single foundation: the fragile confidence of trust. Lose it, and even the mighty will fall. Keep it, and even the weak can rise. That is the hidden truth of nations. And the real meaning of bankruptcy. It is not merely a financial failure. It is a failure of trust. And the rebuilding begins, not in banks or policies, but in hearts and minds, ready to believe again.